As Todd mentioned, unemployment right now in the United States is about 17%. If you include people that have given up or have part-time jobs who are looking for full-time. It's worse in construction. It's approximately 25% if you're in the construction industry, and it's going to get worse this year. If you recently came out of the military, if you're Afghan or an Iraqi war vet, the unemployment's even worse for you guys. I would imagine unemployment's touched many of you in this room. I'll tell you about a story of a friend of mine named Mike. Mike is an X-ray technician. He works and has been doing X-ray technician work for 25 years. Mike lost his job last summer when the hospital closed. That's a warning sign. Hospitals closing is a bad sign for our economy. It took Mike 6 months to find another job, and he sent out 200 resumes to finally find a job 100 miles from his house. Now, normally someone in the healthcare field would have found that type of job in a matter of days. Another entity I would like to talk about is a company in Scottsdale called Microsemi, a boutique chip manufacturer. Next April 2011, 300 good white-collar jobs are going over to Malaysia. Now we could talk about jobs, and there's a lot of reasons why we're losing jobs. I'm very concerned about the loss of blue-collar jobs that have gone overseas and Washington didn't care. White-collar jobs that have gone overseas, Washington didn't care. Now we're losing jobs that we never would have thought about before. Some accounting, some legal work. And one of my favorite examples is if you break your leg at 3 o'clock in the morning, where may your x-ray be read at by now? India. Why is this happening? Again, there's a lot of reasons, but I want to focus on two. Number one, our combined corporate tax rate, which is the federal and state corporate tax rate, the average is 39.3%. That is the second highest amongst 30 democratic countries in the world, the second highest. That's one reason. Second reason is many of our regulations are stifling. My favorite example is the U.S. steel industry. There is approximately 26 regulatory bodies that have imposed more than 5,700 regulations on that great industry. When my parents were growing up, the U.S. steel industry was the powerhouse in the world. Right now, we produce 30% less steel than Japan. Little tiny Japan produces more steel than us. That's a sin. I'll come back to what I'm going to do about that in a second, but let's switch gears now to the economy as a whole. I'd like to talk about jobs and the economy a little bit separately, and then I'll bring them back. The economy. I don't know about you guys, but what's happening in Washington is atrocious. They are spending money that they don't have and borrow money from our children and grandchildren's future. Happy anniversary to the $787 billion stimulus package, just a little over a year ago. What did we get out of it?
Nothing.
Very few sustainable jobs, 9,000 pork barrel projects, including $54 million to move the Napa Valley wine train, and the list goes on and on. And what is Obama's answer to all this? Well, a deficit projected this year to be $1.6 trillion for the next 12 months. And his answer to that is to set up a commission to look at this issue. Who's on the commission?
Andy Stewart.
There's 6 Democrats, 6 Republicans. Now that sounds pretty fair. And then 6 people he's appointed. That commission is going to present its findings after the November elections. Sure. The deficit. What is it right now? What number again? I think one of the panelists mentioned it, but do you guys remember where we are today?
13 trillion.
A little over 13 trillion, going up to 14 trillion. This is just has to stop, and it has to stop now. This deficit cannot be sustained. We talked about earlier in one of my quiz questions, next year we're going to approach 94 to 100% of the ratio between the deficit and the gross domestic product. That's unsustainable. So, going to Washington, what am I going to do about these particular 2 topics? I'm fairly analytical. I like to break these things down. As Todd mentioned, we've been talking about this for 6 months, trying to message this out, trying to figure out what we really could accomplish without sounding like a politician, with a laundry list of 50 things to do. We started out with a lot of lists. What could work? What might not work? So I want to give you our answer, my answer, what I'm going to do in Washington on these two topics, and go through that. Number one, I firmly believe the federal component of the corporate tax rate needs to be reduced and reduced significantly to help drive some jobs back, stimulate job growth, and hold our own. By doing that, we will try to take something called free trade, you heard about that, or that sort of topic, and bring back the topic of equal trade. We have to be able to compete on an equal footing with other countries. If we can't compete equally, we will continue to lose our jobs. We will continue to have a trade deficit like I mentioned earlier. It's approaching $1 trillion per year. It's unsustainable. So we will be calling for, number one, a reduction of the federal corporate tax rate. The federal component is 35%, from 35% down to 15%. Step number two. Now the step number two, when I first started running for Congress, talking to people, step number two seemed too far out there. But after talking to many constituents and people in the neighborhood, step number two is now more believable. Step number two to me is fundamental to this whole race. Step number two is a balanced budget. Ideally through a balanced budget amendment, but we have to get our fiscal house in order. Our campaign has been wearing these red armbands that say stop the bleeding, to remind ourselves every day about fiscal responsibility. The general term about fiscal responsibility to me really is all about balancing the budget. Now, if the Republicans and the Democrats and the independents in Washington can agree on that fundamental principle of balanced budget amendment or a balanced budget, if we can get them to agree and we can all agree, we have all won, our grandchildren have won, then we can spend all the time we want arguing with the Democrats and independents about how much money for defense, how much for entitlements, how much for this, how much for that. But it's got to be through a balanced budget. And the third thing is stop any future tax increases of different sorts. So again, step number one, reduction in the federal component of the corporate tax rate from 35% to 15%. Keep it simple. Number two, a balanced budget amendment. With that, I want to conclude my component, and we're going to then turn this over to our part number two. Anybody have any questions at this point?